It's fairly obvious that dying from some long drawn-out disease is a terrible way to die, but it's far from the only one. David Allen Kerwin and a friend were visiting Yellowstone National Park. David's friend had brought a dog to the park with him, a dog that, like most dogs, loved to dive into water and swim, but Yellowstone, filled with pools of water sometimes over 200 degrees Fahrenheit, is not the place for swimming. The dog, named Moosey, got free from the car and ran for a nearby pool of water and jumped in. The dog began yelping from the pain, and David ran for the dog. Against the warnings of other park visitors not to jump in after him, he went in after Moosey anyway. He swam out to get Moosey, but was unable to retrieve him due to the immense burning. David was pulled back out of the pool and was completely blind and had suffered third-degree burns to his entire body. When a park visitor tried to remove one of his shoes, his flesh came off with it. David remarked that what he had done was stupid and asked how bad he was. He was bad enough that he died in the hospital the following morning. Moosey also did not survive. Hiroshi Ouchi was a nuclear worker in Japan who met with something of an occupational hazard. He was exposed to tremendous amounts of radiation, so much so that his skin began to slowly fall off his body. His chromosomes were entirely destroyed by the radiation, and his body was wasting away. He had been exposed to levels of radiation over 2 times higher than required to kill someone. After being treated for a week, Hiroshi begged to die. After 10 days, he could no longer even communicate. It's believed he was being kept alive for purposes of morbid scientific curiosity. He was kept alive for about 3 months, even resuscitated if his heart stopped. His death was absolute torture and one that exposed Japan's nuclear safety myth. The Salem witch trials were a horrendous event. Numerous people were accused of witchcraft back in those days, which was punishable by death. Horrible superstitions ran rampant and spread wrongful death along with it. For Giles Corey, a man by the age of 71 when he was accused of witchcraft, he refused to give in to the legal process and would not plead guilty or innocent to the charges against him. He found them ridiculous. There was a law for that. If a person would not allow for a trial to take place, they would be pressed. That's what Giles Corey faced. Lying naked on a floor, he had a plank of wood set on top of him, and rocks were piled on, slowly crushing him. Time went on, as did more and more rocks. The weight became so much at one point that his tongue popped out of his mouth and had to be forced back in. Each time he was asked to plea, he simply said, "More weight." After 2 days of torture, Giles succumbed to the torture and died. It's believed his final words were, "More weight." Assassins aren't often looked on with favor. Balthazar Gerard was responsible for the shooting assassination of the Dutch revolutionist William the Silent in 1584. Balthazar was brought before magistrates where he showed no remorse for what he had done. Without even an attempt to lie to cover his tracks, he was sentenced to death by torture. Balthazar was tied to a pole and whipped mercilessly. Overnight, his feet and hands would be bound together to make sleep impossible. Day after day, he was tied to the pole. 300-pound weights were hung from his big toes and left there for half an hour. Well-oiled shoes made of dog skin, far too small for his feet, were forced on and held over a fire. The shoes contracted tightly and crushed his feet into useless stumps. The shoes were forcefully removed and tore off his flesh with them. His armpits were branded and burning hot bacon fat was spilled all over his body. Then nails were hammered between the flesh and nails of his hands and feet. Balthazar was said to remain calm during his torture and died days after it all began. Racism can inspire horrendous things. Emmett Till was 14 years old in 1955 and was visiting family in Mississippi. The exact story isn't clear, but it's believed that Emmett had an interaction with 21-year-old Carolyn Bryant, a married woman who was a proprietor of a small grocery store. Some accounts claimed he wolf whistled at her, which was the most likely event. However, Emmett whistled to alleviate his stutter, not to flirt with women. Other accounts claim he was much more forward with his flirting. Either way, Carolyn's husband Roy and his half-brother went to the home Emmett was staying at and took him away out to a barn. They beat him beyond recognition and gouged out one of his eyes before shooting him in the head and dumping his body into a river. Roy and his half-brother were both acquitted of the kidnapping and murder charges, and after they were freed, under the protection of double jeopardy, a defense that prohibits being put on trial for the same crime twice, they sold an interview to Look magazine where they fully confessed to killing Emmett Till. Places designed for entertainment and fun can still be host to terrible dangers. Deborah Gale Stone was an 18-year-old girl in 1974 who worked as a hostess for the Disneyland attraction America Sings, which was a large theater that hosted an outer ring of seats that rotated around a fixed center which housed a number of different stages. It's not clear how it happened exactly, but while the seating was rotating, Deborah accidentally stepped into a small channel between the rotating wall and a stationary wall. Deborah was caught between the two and began screaming as she was crushed to death in what was considered to be the happiest place on Earth. It's believed a number of people thought the screams were actually a part of the show. The attraction was promptly shut down so safety precautions could finally be installed. Kelly Ann Bates proves that dating an abuser is a very bad idea. She was only 17 years old in 1996 when she was brutally murdered by her much older partner, but it wasn't a quick death. Her partner, James Patterson Smith, tortured her over a period of 4 weeks. Her body, when examined, horrified even seasoned veterans in the field. He had broken bones, burned her numerous times. He stabbed her with knives, forks, and scissors. He stabbed her inside of her mouth, crushed both of her hands, mutilated her ears, nose, eyebrows, mouth, and genitalia. He wounded her with gardening tools, partially scalped her, and gouged out both of her eyes and stabbed the empty sockets. The examiner claimed that she had had her eyes gouged out around 5 days into the month-long torture. James eventually ended the poor girl's suffering by drowning her in a bathtub. He was sentenced to life in prison. A number of jury members had to receive counseling from being shown the evidence in the case. We know that oil drilling can pose a significant threat to the environment, but also to its workers. Byford Dolphin is a semi-submersible drilling rig. It's had its fair share of unfortunate accidents, one specifically in 1983 that involved explosive decompression. 4 divers were inside a decompression chamber system that was attached to a diving bell. The pressure inside the chambers was at 9 atmospheres. Through a slip-up in procedure, one of the diving tenders outside opened the clamp in the trunk connecting to the diving bell before diver 4 closed the door in chamber 1. The divers were all exposed to the effects of explosive decompression, dropping from a pressure of 9 atmospheres to 1 atmosphere in a fraction of a second. One of the divers violently exploded, internal organs blowing out in all directions, all limbs tearing off, even his spine was ejected. His remains were found scattered around the rig as far as 30 feet away. 5 people died, including the tender who opened the clamp. The second tender was severely injured, but survived. There's nothing like a good old-fashioned revolution. György Doza led a peasants' rebellion against the Kingdom of Hungary as peasants began to experience less and less freedom. György's rebellion was eventually squashed, however, and he was captured. György was given a throne, but not the type he would have hoped for. It was a throne of iron, heated, burning hot. He was forced to sit down onto it and he burned. A heated iron crown was placed atop his head and he was forced to hold a heated scepter in his hand. Over 70,000 peasants were tortured for their part in the rebellion and 9 were present for György's torture. They had been starved before the event and brought out one by one. Hot pliers were taken out and grabbed into parts of György's flesh, tearing parts away. The starved peasants were forced to eat from the gaping wounds. Anyone who refused was sliced apart immediately. Georgi eventually died of his injuries while on the throne. Sometimes we must be reminded that true evil certainly does exist. Junko Furuta was a 16-year-old Japanese high school student who was in her 3rd year when she was suddenly abducted by 4 teenage boys and taken to a house belonging to one of the kidnappers' parents. The parents were present for some of what came next, but never tried to intervene as they were fearful of their own son. Junko was tortured and raped for over 40 days in the house. While there, she was fed cockroaches to eat and her own urine to drink. She was set on fire multiple times. Foreign objects were inserted into her body and she was beaten violently day after day. Each and every day brought a new form of hell for Junko. She had weights dropped on her stomach while she was tied to the floor. She'd be hung from the ceiling and be used as a punching bag. Her brain eventually shrunk from the level of abuse that was inflicted upon her. Eventually, she was beaten, set on fire, and went into shock and died. Her corpse was found inside a concrete-filled barrel. It's believed she had been raped between 400 to 500 times. All of the boys were sentenced to prison time, but none of them exceeded a 20-year sentence. That's all for this episode. Be sure to subscribe, and I will see you next time. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel now so you don't miss the next episode of Seriously Strange.